If you want to become a game developer, there are a few things you need to consider. First off, you want to ask yourself why you want to become a game developer in the first place. Whether you want to make games for money on the side, practice your programming skills, or just want a new hobby in your life, it's important to understand the reasons you're getting into indie game dev. Along with the reasons, you want to define some goals, and it's important to stick to those goals as much as possible, as goal setting has been proven to improve your motivation by giving you a tangible outcome of your work. For example, a good goal for beginner indie devs would be something like make a simple 2D platformer game with 3 levels where you progress through the levels with running and jumping. Something very small in scope and very achievable. By setting goals like this, you'll be following a set path rather than wandering aimlessly in random directions and wasting time on things you shouldn't be wasting your time on. Remember that game development takes a very long time to do anything, so time is your greatest ally. Therefore, it's important to manage it properly. Professional software developers utilize something called software development lifecycle methodologies. I recommend looking into agile and waterfall methodologies as they are the most popular methodologies that software developers use to manage their time properly and to deliver products on time. After you have set your goals and methodologies, it's now time to plan your actual project. I cannot stress how important it is to plan your project. Project management is a massive part of game development. I recommend you make something called a game design document to jot down your deliverables and early plannings, mind map for the more detailed planning of the project scope, and something called a work breakdown structure. And if you want, you can also make something like a Trello board to manage completed tasks. Of course, these are just my recommendation of planning tools. You can use whatever planning tools you like. And of course, it's better to always plan and not just jump in. An important thing I mentioned earlier is a work breakdown structure. You can break down the work in your project in your current scope to understand the exact time it's going to take to complete the project, and then you can assess your scope from there to see if you can expand your scope or decrease your scope to fit your time needs. Speaking of scope, the number one issue I see indie devs running into is scope creep. I see a lot of people not taking it seriously, and they end up losing motivation because they set their scope way too big and end up using a lot of time creating assets or just creating features, and they realize that they won't ever be able to finish their project. So make sure before you start jumping into the actual development of the game, you plan and make sure 100% that your scope is correct and realistic for your time needs. You don't want to waste years on your first project because your scope has been set way too large. 99% of indie games are never released because of this exact issue. You need to drop the ego and just start small, especially as a solo developer. On the flip side of the scope creep issue, indie developers can also run into overanalyzing and planning, where they can just become paralyzed and not ever start doing anything. And to overcome this, you should just jump in and start developing after you planned your project. Don't overanalyze everything you're doing, question everything you're doing, just stick to your plan and get to development. Features that you implement in the beginning are not going to be great. The assets that you have are not going to be great, and that's just how it is. You just have to deal with it and get through it. Another important consideration is picking the right tools for the job, and the most important tool being the game engine. Now, you might be enamored by Unreal Engine and Unity's slew of features, but I recommend that you don't use those if you're a very, very beginner. The complexity and just the sheer size of those engines are going to get in the way of the features that you want to implement. You're not going to be implementing these crazy features that these AAA companies are making, which is what these engines are designed for. You're going to be trying to do very simple things. And doing those simple things in these huge engines, it's gonna get in the way. The complexity is gonna get in the way. Trust me, I speak from experience when I say start small with your engines. So I recommend picking something smaller like Godot or GameMaker Studio 2. Unreal Engine is like 150 gigabytes and Godot is 110 megabytes. So it is much more lightweight, and it's also FOSS, free and open source software. So it is very bug-free, and its documentation is amazing compared to Unreal Engine, and you will not be running into nearly as many bugs or crashes as you would with Unreal Engine. The marketing that Epic Games has done with Unreal Engine has been great, but it is only showing very few use cases in perfect curated scenarios. Unreal Engine is actually incredibly buggy, and Nanite and Lumen, for example, don't work well with anything other than what they've shown. Don't get me wrong, Unreal Engine is amazing for FPS realistic 3D games. It's actually the best at it. The point I'm trying to get at is that engines are designed for specific things. If you want to make a simple 2D or very low poly 3D simple game, I'd recommend going with Godot. Unreal Engine, for example, has completely deprecated its 2D support. Making a 2D game in Unreal Engine is way harder than it should be. So if you want to make a 2D game, go with Godot or GameMaker 2 if you're a beginner. It is not a bad choice at all. I'm actually using Godot right now to develop a mobile game on the side, so don't think it's just a beginner-only engine. Remember, the tools do not define you as a developer. You can make the same game in 5 different engines if you want. It's just which tool is curated for your needs the most. And I'm willing to bet that your first game is not going to be a hyper-realistic first-person shooter, so that's why I recommend Unreal Engine is not your first choice as your game engine. Unity suffers from a lot of the same issues that Unreal Engine has, being one of these giants in the game engine world. It is huge, made for these AAA companies, so it comes with a lot of complexity and needed upkeep, so it has a lot of bugs and crashes that you're going to be dealing with. It's just not a fun experience as a solo developer. You can still use these engines if you really want to, but remember, you can program all the same features yourself in one of the smaller, lighter weight engines. The only thing holding you back is yourself. But in my experience, the second most common motivation issue that indie game developers run into is constantly having to fight with the tools rather than just develop the game. If you pick one of the smaller, lighter weight game engines, you're not going to be fighting with the tools as much as the other engines, you're just going to be thinking of how to implement your features. And that leads nicely into my next point, which is programming languages. An engine like Unreal Engine, you are forced to use C++ or Blueprints. Blueprints are okay, but it's kind of the exact opposite of C++. There's no middle ground between Blueprints and C++. There's some things that you just can't do in Blueprints, and since Blueprints is visual scripting, it doesn't really teach you how to program at all. So if you find yourself needing to implement a feature in C++ and Unreal Engine if you're using Blueprints only, you're not going to know how to do anything. Blueprints does not teach you how to program. Whereas something like Godot or GameMaker uses dynamic languages such as GDScript or GML, GameMaker language. They're actual scripting languages, and they're very powerful compared to Blueprints in my opinion, and they allow you to learn the fundamentals of programming in a very easy way. I think somebody starting from nothing could learn GDScript in a week if they wanted to. It's not hard. It's not something like C++ where I say, if you want to learn C++ and become proficient at it, you need at least like 2 to 3 months. But GDScript is a nice segue into learning programming if you're a super beginner. And it's very satisfying. You don't have to compile. That's another thing. C++, you have to build and compile, whereas these interpreted languages, you just type it up and boom, test it. And when you're a beginner programmer, you're going to be making a lot of mistakes, a lot of bugs, so having that quick turnaround time on testing is perfect. If you're new to programming in general, if there's one recommendation I could give you, it's to learn the syntax and the concepts of object-oriented programming down to the T. That means learn the concepts of encapsulation, inheritance, polymorphism, and abstraction. Learn them all, know exactly how they relate to the syntax in your language. It's so important to understand what you're actually programming, so you're not just forever copy-pasting other people's code. You need to develop the abilities to create stuff on your own. After you've decided on your game engine, the next thing you need to consider are game assets. As a solo developer, the most time-consuming thing is creating game assets. Game assets are anything that is not programming or working with the tools. It's the models, the sound, the art, all of that stuff, the shaders. It's the assets, the actual meat of the game. Trust me, that takes absolutely forever. So if you're starting out from the beginning and want to make just a fun, quick game, I recommend going to something like itch.io or somewhere else you can get free assets and download some free assets and start making your game. While I don't recommend doing this forever, think it's a great option for new developers, and you can always just practice making your own game assets on the side until they are at the quality that you want them to be at. Finally, I want to remind you that once again, just start making things that are simple, easy, and that you think are cool. Establish a workflow and try to constantly improve it. Don't get upset at yourself when you're stuck on something that seems simple. It happens to all software developers, and remember to have fun. That is the most important thing, is to have fun. Because if you're not enjoying it or you don't learn to enjoy it, you're going to end up losing motivation. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.